All right, moving. Hey! Got him. Good hit! Welcome to Explosive Enterprises, and the VFC AK-74M has been a hotly anticipated entry to the limited lineup of Airsoft gas blowback AKs. Today, as usual, we're going over this gun's history, externals, internals, performance. You guys know the drill by now. Let's jump into it. The real AK-74M was introduced by Ishmash in 1991 as an incremental revision of the AK-74, the M standing for Modernizovaný or modernized. Fundamentally, it's still the same 545x39 rifle as the original 74, it just has a bunch of minor changes to simplify manufacturing and correct efficiencies, and a few major changes to improve its versatility and replace the myriad of AK-74 variants then in use. The 74M features a side-folding polymer solid stock on a reinforced 5.5mm hinge pin, combining the folding capability of the AK-74 with the better cheek weld and integral storage capability of the solid stock 74. It also has a simplified side rail as standard for compatibility with optics, eliminating the need for a separate 74N variant. So no more variants for stock type or optic compatibility or wood versus polymer furniture. With the 74M, what you get is what you get. While it would spawn a number of caliber and length variants designated the AK-100 series, the 74M itself would remain essentially unchanged in Russian use until the introduction of the KM-AK modernization kit in 2015, and modern AK-74Ms produced in that configuration are now designated AK-200. To put it bluntly, while the Russian Federation has developed a number of purported successors to the AK-74M, it lacks the resources to actually replace existing stockpiles of usable small arms, and it appears the AK-74M will remain in military service for the foreseeable future. VFC's replica is ostensibly a 1993 production AK-74M, but I'll say right now that it does have historical inaccuracies, some small, some not so small, that I'll note as we go. Leaving aside authenticity, overall external impressions conditions are pretty good. It's painted, and while it looks the part for a post-Soviet rifle with a slightly gray, slightly chalky finish, it does scratch pretty easily and already shows wear from use. That said, almost the entire rifle is steel, which gives the inevitable wear a much more realistic character than on pot metal replicas, and the only parts that aren't steel are the plastic furniture and a couple of light gray aluminum details. Let's go piece by piece, starting at the muzzle. This is the distinctive muzzle brake, and on the very first part we already see a minor inaccuracy. This is the pre-M AK-74 style, where on an actual AK-74M, the neck at the rear continues all the way up to the vents. It's a nitpick, but it sets the stage for things to come. Anyways, the brake itself is a little loose, but nowhere near enough to impede function, and it unscrews to reveal a 24mm positive threaded adapter over a standard Airsoft 14mm negative barrel threading. This is glued in place and is proven difficult to remove, so I'm not going to try. Under the brake is the cleaning rod, which is a simple chunk of steel. Removing it reveals a screw, which is part of the securing mechanism for the front sight. Now, unlike on earlier AKs, both the front sight base and gas block are press-fit into place, as evidenced by these divots, and VFC has correctly replicated this process. But then to ensure the parts are properly tight and aligned, VFC has added a tiny screw threading into each one and tensioning against the barrel. So if either is misaligned, it's a simple matter to loosen the screw, correct the alignment, and tighten again. This is not like VFC's FAL or FNC, where that securing screw is the only thing holding the component in place. It's just for final alignment and tightening. Back to the front sight. The sight post itself is adjustable for elevation by threading in and out, and for windage by drifting the drum over, which can be done with a suitably large hammer or with a sight adjustment tool like some sort of non-gorilla sentient being. The gas block is fairly nondescript, but it does conceal a funny mechanism we'll get to later. The upper handguard is also as expected, tensioned by a piece of spring steel, though the handguard itself can rotate around the gas block, which is not uncommon. The lower handguard, however, has a problem. On a real handguard, the three prongs at the front are a steel overmolded insert that tensions against the receiver cap. On the VFC, they're part of the plastic mold, so any stress applied to the handguard can easily break these plastic prongs, and then the handguard won't be retained. This is a terrible design, and I don't know what they were thinking. Barely into this review, and we're already finding durability problems. I bet I know what you're thinking. Is this gonna be like that GHK AKM?
Wouldn't you like to know, weather boy?
We'll get there. Oh yeah, and note that the barrel is both steel and one piece. I point that out because most VFCs have had alloy barrels with at best a steel front section, but nope, this is full steel. Moving back to the rear sight, this is graduated out to 1000 meters in increments of 100, plus a P setting for a Postianaya or constant, which is just a battle sight setting. Funny thing here is that this appears to raise the sight to the same height as the 300 meter setting, which is correct for a 7.62 AK, but not correct for a 5.45 like this 74M, where it should be the same as 400 meters. Well, let's file that under things that don't matter for Airsoft and move on, but not before I point out that this rear sight is by far the tightest I've seen on an Airsoft gun with no lateral play at all. That means you can actually use the irons effectively on this AK without them wobbling from side to side and spoiling the zero. It's pretty damn sad that that's noteworthy, but that's Airsoft for you. You may notice a divot on the barrel pin on the front trunnion, and that's from hitting it with a punch to remove, so just be aware that these pins are fairly soft, and it would be better to use a flat punch the same diameter as the pins to remove them. The dust cover is plain bent steel, smooth as is correct for 74M, and held on by an early style takedown button. The charging handle on the carrier is the correct AK-74 style, whereas a lot of Airsoft replicas reuse the AKM style, and note that this wear is a result of some tinkering with Aftermarket and should not appear on a stock gun. We'll talk about that later. Behind it, the selector is a standard AK style, and it clicks nicely between positions, requiring a bit of force just like a real one. It is also appropriately marked in Cyrillic for the auto and semi positions. On the receiver itself, we have proper solid rivets, not hollow, holding together the gun's major components, and these are as solid as we would expect for a real AK. The mag release is also riveted in place, as is its housing. The trigger appears to be a replica of an early AK-74 trigger, so not correct for a 74M as it has a bit too much material on the front side. And the pistol grip is plain black plastic with a 1-1 mold marking that appears to be plausible for an Ishmash rifle. I say Ishmash because if I turn over the gun, we can see the Ishmash logo accurately replicated, a 1993 production date, and a serial number which is unique to each gun. Now while most AK-74Ms would have an additional rivet below the serial number, a so-called bump rivet which acts as a guide for the bolt, 1993 is early enough that it's plausible for this gun to omit it, so while not typical for a 74M, it could be considered accurate nonetheless. The stock retainer latch is below and also riveted in. You can also see these very faint circular marks, which are meant to replicate the spot welds used to secure the action rails to the receiver on the real one, but are purely decorative and quite shallow here. The sight rail is not riveted, instead it's screwed in from the inside because it must be removed for complete disassembly, so these rivets are fake. But the rivets for the rear trunnion are real, and here we find the biggest source of online wailing and gnashing of teeth concerning this replica. To summarize, this rear trunnion uses a 4.5mm pin and sits at a 6-degree downward angle, which would be correct for an AK-74, but the 74M uses a 5.5mm pin and sits at a shallower 4-degree angle. So this will not accept real 74M stocks without modification, and even if the hinge is bored out to 5.5mm, a real stock will angle downwards just a bit and look a little weird. This matters to some because the VFC stock looks a little weird to start with, having a pronounced gap at the hinge. The stock is otherwise close to that of the real gun, having a sling swivel on the right, a trapdoor for a cleaning kit on the back, and locking up against the receiver such that it unfolds when the button is pressed. This one is tight, but if there is wobble, a bit of electrical tape on the inside of the trunnion will fix that. It looks a little weird, but functionally it's just fine. And lastly, the magazine. This was another source of contention because like VFC's ARP mags, this is metal rather than plastic. Worse, actually, because it's an aluminum body with a plastic top cap and a plastic feed track insert on the front. So it will pick up nicks and scratches that expose bare metal, while the seams on the feed track on the front are visible to close inspection. This is where, in the interest of fairness, I'd like to say GHK actually did this better, but GHK 545 mags are half an inch too long, don't have the ribs, and are just kind of weirdly shaped, so they're both funny in their own ways. Well, as you'll see, there are reasons why VFC did this mag the way they did, and to be honest, the grainy paint finish lets them pass for plastic until they start accumulating wear. At least that's fixable with paint if it comes down to it. Oh, and I should mention this mag weighs 387 grams empty, so it's pretty light for what it is. All that said, as with our prior GHK review, I've gone through all the externals without mentioning quality control issues. And that's because this time around they're extremely minor and really don't matter. Out of the box, the gas block was slightly canted, and as mentioned before, that was easy to fix by just loosening the securing screw, adjusting the block, tightening again. We also notice that the receiver narrows inwards very slightly from the valve knocker assembly to the front trunnion, likely as a result of the riveting process, but this is symmetrical on both sides, so the gun remains straight and aligned, and it does not appear to cause any problems for the bolt carrier. And one of the rivets on the front trunnion appears to be slightly angled, but it's still tight. The barrel is aligned to the receiver, the front and rear sights are aligned to each other and to the receiver, I can't significantly flex the receiver with my bare hands, and everything is tight as it should be. There are some issues we'll get into later that suggest VFC rushed this initial batch, but nonetheless the external build quality is very good, and I'm only pointing out these details for the sake of completeness. Overall, while the VFC does have some nitpicky inaccuracies as compared to a real 74M, they got more of the small details right than they got wrong. The biggest issues externally are that the paint is fragile, and the lower handguard inexplicably relies on plastic retention tabs, but these are straightforward to fix. And when I pick up the rifle, I don't notice the gap on the stock, the seams on the magazine, or the scratches on the paint. I notice the heft and balance, weighing it a nice 7¼ pounds or 3.3 kilograms, with the front heaviness I expect from a real AK, and there's no wobble or creak anywhere. While externally this isn't perfect by any means, it is a well-built full steel AK, and I think that counts for a lot. So let's field strip, and this mostly goes like a normal AK. First, remove the dust cover, which will be very tight out of the box, but will break in or can be slightly bent inward on the back to clear the receiver more easily. Then remove the spring guide. Make sure the safety is set to one of the fire positions, then the bolt carrier comes back. Now the nozzle doesn't strictly need to line up with the cutout on the receiver to come out, but it will make it a little bit easier. So just pull it back as needed, then lift the carrier out. With the piston removed, I can now unlock the gas tube and remove it. Then flip up the locking tab on the lower handguard retainer, slide it forwards, and remove the lower handguard. That's it for field stripping, so again we go piece by piece. The only thing to note in the barrel assembly is that there is a plastic puck inside the gas block, apparently retained by an O-ring, which serves as a buffer for the piston on the return stroke. It doesn't have much give, it's just softer than steel hitting steel. Now to be clear, this is sufficient disassembly to access the hop already, but there's something I want to show you, so I'll remove the rear sight block. First the screw comes out the bottom of the rear sight block, then I drive out a cross pin, and it slides forwards. What you see here is the retention system for the outer barrel, a very large cross pin that sets the correct depth of the barrel, and 2 screws that thread into the barrel and set the alignment. As you can see, we already carved slots into these screws to make them easier to remove, which was necessary for the front screw as it was firmly glued in place, not unlike the gas key screws on VFC ARs. This system of mounting the barrel is tight and provides repeatable alignment, so if Aftermarket produces a 105 length barrel, it should be fairly easy to swap in, though note that if you do take these screws out, you must thread lock them when reinstalling or they will vibrate loose. There's no need need to mess with any of this though, and the barrel can be safely left alone. There are 2 screws securing the hop unit to the outer barrel, and unscrewing these allows the hop assembly to slide out the back. The outer barrel has a fairly large inner diameter for the first 8 inches or so, which gives a little wiggle room to clear the receiver without having to bend the barrel. The hop unit comes apart by first prying off a metal indexing tab, then removing the adjustment wheel and dropping out the nub, and lastly by pushing the barrel and bucking out the back of the feed ramp. This is a peculiar design, but it seems to work quite well. We have a standard VFC blue bucking on a 285mm inner barrel, and the bucking is held at the correct depth by a shoulder on the feed ramp piece. That metal indexing tab in turn aligns to the rib and cutouts on the inner barrel and does a good job of keeping it rigidly indexed, and hop is applied by the wheel acting on this nub, which is a metal piece with a frankly bizarre contact patch design. Well, we'll test performance later, but either way I think it should be pretty easy to 3D print alternative designs, and there might even be room for a conventional rubber nub here. My only gripe with this hop design is that there's nothing to properly index the bucking to the barrel, so if you do swap the barrel it takes a bit of guess and check to get the bucking aligned properly. The barrel to hop unit and hop unit to outer barrel alignment are both fixed and rigid, however, so getting the bucking aligned is the only part with room for error. On the bolt carrier, the piston is either aluminum or stainless steel, we're admittedly not yet sure which, and like the real 74M, it lacks the gas rings of earlier variants. It threads into a big chunky steel bolt carrier weighing about 385 grams, quite a lot of mass and comparable to a VFC steel AR bolt carrier paired with an H3 buffer, or to a GHK AKM. Obviously there's some wear, which has accumulated over about 10,000 rounds so far. The smoothing on the underside is the natural result of use, and notice how it highlights machining marks. It looks like VFC didn't do much post-processing on these parts, but since they do naturally polish with use, this doesn't seem to be a problem. You may have also noticed that this nozzle is biased forwards and bounces a bit, something VFC has done on a couple of designs. To remove the nozzle, I first pull it back while unscrewing the retaining screw at the back, then unscrew the cross pin for the nozzle stop, and the nozzle comes out the front. Note that this return spring plug has an O-ring, which may remain in the carrier during disassembly, and if replacement is needed, a 5mm inner diameter, 9mm outer diameter ring makes a good seal. It may not be obvious on camera, but this is a chunky nozzle with a 22mm nominal diameter. I say nominal because the main O-ring is deliberately undersized just a little, being a bit under 22mm in outer diameter, and relies on pressure to seal. This seems to work better than we expected, but it does seem to wear down over time and then struggles in cold weather, so if replacement is needed, a 22mm outer diameter, 18mm inner diameter O-ring is a good fit. Punching out the rear cross pin frees the return spring, and you can see that VFC achieved that standoff essentially just by stretching the front half of the spring. So when extended, it returns the nozzle, and when retracted, it pushes the nozzle. We have a theory for why this is done, particularly since the parts diagram shows a more conventional spring, but we'll come back to that. Punching out the other cross pin frees the rocket valve, and this appears to be the same as on the FNC. This gun shoots under 1.5 joules out of the box at room temperature, so whether replacement is necessary will depend on your environment, but flipping the valve will reduce it to under a joule, or a CL Project adjustable valve is a drop-in fit. If you go the adjustable route, it does not appear necessary to flip it to achieve stable output, but we suggest filing the end of the grub screw flatter to improve consistency and reduce denting of the cross pin. The only other thing to mention with the nozzle is that it has this T-shaped protrusion that indexes it to the bolt carrier. I'm reminded of the fragile wings on the GHK carrier, but so far we haven't had any problems with this design, just keep it lubricated as this is a friction point. Now 2 notes on reassembly. First, be extremely careful about lining up the return spring correctly and then driving the cross pin through. If the spring looks funny to you, it's because the first time I had the nozzle open, I accidentally hit the wire with the pin and broke it, so I had to rebend the loop at the end. And second, because the return spring plug is now free and loose, it's a pain to reinstall back on the carrier. We suggest you stick a thin screwdriver through the back of the carrier, use this to push the return spring plug into the nozzle, and then carefully guide the nozzle into the carrier until the plug aligns to the hole at the back. Make sure the flat sides on it line up with the flats of the hole, and push the nozzle back while inserting the screw and tighten hard. Once that's done, you can gently pull the nozzle out into the side to insert the nozzle stop. There's one last issue to mention on the carrier, and that's the distinctive peening on the left side from the carrier contacting the trunnion. It seems that VFC cut it a little too close on their tolerancing, and the buffer in the gas block has just enough give for the carrier to slam into the trunnion and start to distort. The good news is that it seems by about 5,000 rounds the wear finished settling in and has not progressed further, but it may be necessary to file down the displaced material to avoid unwanted contact with the dust cover. Alright, that's it for the carrier, onto the fire control group. I'm not going to pull this apart, and I don't recommend anyone else to do so because it's annoying to get back together with the valve knocker assembly in the way, but I can at least explain what's going on here. At the front, the valve knocker is spring-loaded and retained by this block, which sets the maximum height of the magazine and is secured by screws running through two faux rivets, one on the right side and the other concealed by the side rail. On the right side is the auto sear, which is actuated by a spring that doubles as a shepherd's hook to retain all the crosspins. The hammer does not strike the valve knocker so much as cam it forwards, and the spring tension operating on it comes from this braided wire spring, just like on a real AK. The trigger incorporates a disconnector, which behaves as you'd expect, but also a mock rate reducer mechanism. On a real AK, this is a system with drags on the hammer to slow it down, which delays it from falling until any bolt bounce has settled. Well, here, the rate reducer is spring-loaded so that it doesn't actually function, it's just a cosmetic addition to the fire control group. Otherwise, this works just like an AK. On semi, the hammer drops when both the auto sear and trigger release it, then gets grabbed by the disconnector. On auto, the disconnector is held back, and the hammer drops whenever the auto sear trips. Simple enough. On the inside of the receiver, we can also see two screws which secure the side rail. These should be kept tight to ensure the side rail does not come loose. One last thing to note is that we would suggest dripping an oil lubricant into the moving surfaces of the fire control group at regular intervals rather than following our usual advice to use grease. The fire control group is annoying to disassemble to apply grease, and since all of it is decent quality steel, it will self-polish rather than abrade or gall like zinc aluminum parts do, so there's less of a need to clean out sludge. If it starts feeling gritty though, then thorough cleaning may be required, and just note that to remove the pins, you have to bend the shepherd's hook out of the way. The recoil spring is pretty simple, consisting of two loops, just like a real AK, with a recoil spring, a weight, and a second stronger spring up front. This weight may be intended to reduce bolt bounce, but it doesn't seem to work particularly well in that role. I should mention now that the AK design does not have any debounce mechanism, and on the VFC, bolt bounce is quite noticeable. However, VFC appears to have tackled the problem in the opposite direction, allowing the bolt to bounce but mitigating the risk of negative consequences. For one thing, the forward biased nozzle ensures that even as the carrier bounces back, the nozzle is being pushed forwards into the hop-up and will not bounce out. As well, the slightly undersized O-ring does not seal in the carrier when the bolt bounces, so any air that gets pulled into the carrier can safely escape without being vented through the front of the nozzle and potentially dislodging the chambered BB. And lastly, even when the hammer is fully forwards, it still rests behind the bolt carrier, so the carrier would need to bounce a significant distance to impede the hammer at all. This approach seems to work as we have not observed any of the usual problems associated with bolt bounce despite it being plainly visible in our footage. Anyways, the recoil system also incorporates an extremely stiff spring buffer to soak up energy from recoil and kick it back forwards. This significantly increases the cyclic rate and also reduces wear and tear. The gun also comes with an optional plastic short stroke buffer which clips onto the spring. A real AK has about 5.25 inches of travel, while the VFC has a choice of either 3.75 or 3.25, and we'll compare the two when we get to shooting. Finally, we reach the magazine, and this is quite different from VFC's other offerings. As mentioned before, this is a solid block of aluminum with plastic inserts, and quite lightweight, just 387 grams empty. On the bottom, removing the base plate exposes the foreplate seal, but we haven't had to mess with this at all on our magazines. All the interesting parts are at the top. This silver piece is what we'll call a transfer bar, and it is both what the valve knocker in the gun strikes and what actually strikes the output valve. It also serves double duty as a stop on empty mechanism, dropping when the follower comes to the top so that the valve knocker misses it, and popping back down only when the follower passes a critical point. This allows it to remain disabled when the nozzle comes forward on an empty chamber, but is still reset just by loading in new BBs, so it doesn't need to be manually reset like VFC's AK-53 or G3 magazines. I should also mention that while the capacity of these magazines is listed as 42 rounds online, they can actually hold 46, but will only seat on a closed bolt with 45. So, 45 round mags, and they can hold a whopping 40 grams or so of gas before siphoning becomes an issue. Now let's take one apart. Two screws on the top, and then two pins right to left. You might reasonably assume that these pins are retaining some gas sealing component, but that's not the case, and we're not sure why VFC felt the need to use screws in addition to the pins. Regardless, the cap can now come off, and on a stock mag this will usually cause both the stop on empty lever and the torsion spring in the transfer bar to pop out. We suggest immediately bending the short leg of the spring inward slightly, as you can see here, as this will allow it to retain on its own, and this is actually the only thing that holds the transfer bar in place. The gas router pulls right off, and note that this is not a moving design like on some of VFC's magazines. Instead, the idea here seems to be that this very tall router gets enclosed by the angular surface of the nozzle, and that allows it to seal fairly reliably despite inevitable magazine wobble. The feed track slides out the top and contains a spring and follower. Now I can access the output valve, taking care to also extract the front O-ring, which tends to remain in the threading. The output valve is most reminiscent of a GHK valve in that it's a reversed design. Gas comes up the middle, pushes in both directions, and is released out the front when the valve is struck. The advantage of this system is that it works reliably even with weak hammer springs and warm temperatures without light striking. The disadvantage is that it has twice as many seals to maintain, and here is actually the biggest problem with this gun out of the box. All our magazines arrive bone dry, as did the guns, and while for the guns that might just increase friction and accelerate wear, for the magazines it actually causes performance issues. I could take the valve apart by popping off the front E-clip and then extracting the brass cap and O-ring. This allows the stem to come out the back, and here's the problem. For this valve stem to seal on the body of the valve, it needs a tight-fitting O-ring, and with no lubrication, the stem drags against the body, slowing it down. This manifests as reduced efficiency, reduced rate of fire, reduced recoil, and odd hiccuping during full auto. We also tried running oiled green gas through a couple of magazines to see if that would fix it, but no dice. So, these valves need to be extracted in oil or thin grease, not the thicker grade 2 stuff, applied to all the O-rings. Reassemble and exercise the valve thoroughly to make sure it's smooth before fully reassembling. Now with that sorted out, let me show you how the stop on empty works. The stop on empty lever has a small tab that angles inwards, and when the follower comes all the way up, it pushes the lever into a position where it can pop onto a shelf in the feed track. This locks the transfer bar down until the follower is pushed down again, at which point a protrusion on the follower pushes the lever's locking arm to the side, popping it out of place and allowing it to reset. Fairly straightforward, but these are tiny, fragile parts, and it's important to reassemble in a specific arrangement to avoid damage. We suggest loading a couple of BBs into the feed track, then reassembling all the other components, and then getting the top cap back on. Unload the BBs to verify the transfer bar disengages on empty, and then reload a BB or two to verify it resets the transfer bar. Piece of cake. Oh, and note that there is a dry fire mode, but to engage it, you must first push down the follower and then push the switch forwards. Now overall, we feel this is a well-designed gun with a very good system for mounting the barrel, a hop design that is easy both to adjust and to access, and a straightforward design of bolt carrier and nozzle that incorporates simple fixes for bolt bounce and easily accepts an adjustable valve. The fire control is annoying to work on, but it being full steel and the springs being weak means wear ought to be minimal and replacing parts should not be necessary. Aside from the bolt carrier peening, which again will stabilize over time, we actually haven't seen any significant wear across about 9,000 rounds. The parts instead polish with use and are gradually smoothing out a lot compared to the rough state they started in. The combination of weak recoil spring and strong spring buffer is a proven design, and the magazines are definitely weird, but they hold a lot of BBs and a downright absurd amount of gas. The combination of all this is, well, we haven't gotten to shooting yet, but suffice to say there isn't anything we recommend changing here, aside from the nozzle O-ring if it wears out. The biggest oversight is just the complete lack of lubrication anywhere in the internals, and we highly recommend pulling every magazine valve to lubricate it and also lubricating the fire control group and receiver rails. I know it's tedious, but it makes a big difference for performance. I think a lot of people are going to have mediocre first impressions because of the seemingly rushed state VFC decided to ship in, with rough steel parts, that alarming looking peening on the carrier, and all of it bone dry. Once everything is appropriately lubricated and given a few thousand rounds to wear in though, it is very smooth in operation, with the bolt carrier gliding across its track with minimal resistance from the hammer. Now for controls and operation. Insert a magazine at a slight angle into the magwell, pull it forwards, and rock it back to lock. This feels just like a real AK, so if you're accustomed to AEG AKs, this is a lot more forgiving. The hammer is locked on safe, so to charge it, it is necessary to first switch it to auto or semi. Racking it makes quite a nice sound for an airsoft gun, and now it's ready to fire. The trigger pull, well, it sucks. It's light, but has no discernible break at all, and then a noticeable bit of over travel. The reset is at least tangible, though more of a vibration than a click. Whatever, it's an AK and an airsoft one at that. Let's shoot. I like it a lot. The recoil feels pretty similar to the GHK AKM, having a pretty hefty amount of moving weight, but it isn't as sluggish, and it's a nice loud report. Swapping in for short stroke, it's snappier now, but I like that feeling of 400 grams getting thrown around, and now the cyclic rate is noticeably faster than a real AK. There is a use case for the short stroke, but for now, I'll be ditching it. Okay, so let's test efficiency. On a 40 gram fill and continuous semi-auto at room temperature, it manages 430 to 440 shots before it stops cycling far enough to pick up a BB. That's absurd. It's by far the most I've ever seen on a gas gun, owing to the combination of high efficiency, extremely high gas capacity, and the aluminum unibody magazines providing great thermal transfer to offset cooldown. So what about full auto? Well, this brain-dead idiot moron decided to test full auto immediately after shooting well over 400 shots in a row, and with the entire bolt carrier well below freezing, it's struggling a lot more than it should. Redoing the test back at room temperature, on the first mag there's a bit of siphoning evident, so it might be better to fill to 35 grams or so, but it still chews through 45 BBs just fine. With time to warm up between strings, it just manages 6 full mags of BBs, running out on the 7th. Cool. Now the question is what it can do in cold weather, so let's test with a chilled mag and see if that can clear it on semi. I'm using the short stroke buffer here, and this is where it proves useful, keeping the cycle reasonably snappy even with propane delivering a measly 50 or so PSI. Not only does it clear mag on semi, it can clear 2 back-to-back and almost manage a third. It hasn't even consumed half of its gas, so if allowed to warm back up to just above freezing, it'll keep going. I could heap praise on this gun, but the results speak for themselves. The combination of low friction and weak springs yields low resistance to cycling, allowing high efficiency despite the large moving mass, and then when you add in the enormous gas capacity of the magazines, you get ridiculous performance. But keep in mind, this is with the gun properly lubricated. With dry mag valves, it chugs and stutters with less recoil, lower efficiency, and inconsistent fire rate. It's absolutely necessary to lubricate the valves and the gun while you're at it, and then wear it in a bit to get this level of performance. On the chrono, out of the box it did about 1.4 joules, but the drop-in valve allows arbitrary power adjustment. It isn't the most consistent we've seen, but the shot-to-shot delta doesn't exceed 10 FPS, and power loss is negligible over the course of the magazine thanks to the gun's efficiency and high thermal mass. The mags do get cold from use, but that's because they're a single body with no separate shell and readily absorb heat to offset cooldown. Stock hop performance is, despite the odd nub design, as good as we saw with the FNC. Accuracy is excellent, and once dialed in, the hop consistency is good as well. Just keep in mind the hop up does seem to settle in and may need further adjustment over the course of a day of play, but once bedded in, it stays consistent and does not self-adjust. Okay, so performance is great, now let's talk practicality. The magazines are very easy to load, and the enormous gas capacity makes them very hard to overfill, but with the capacity being so high, it can also be tough to fill to a full 40 grams in one go, as the propane bottle will cool down and then stop transferring. To solve this, you can either chill the magazine and fill on the scale, you could fill, wait a few minutes and fill again, or just not worry about it because even if you only get 20 or 30 grams in the mag, it'll still clear multiple mags worth of BBs back to back. The hop up is also easy to adjust in the field, and while it's a bit tough to do with fingers, a screwdriver works fine. As for the gun, well, it's an AK. We've talked AKs on this channel, and I don't really want to rehash it all, so let's summarize. Grip's narrow, stock short, handguard's fine, sights suck. Magazine changes are pretty easy on this replica, but reaching under or over the gun to charge it is as awkward as ever. With it having a steel barrel, the center of balance is so far forwards that I find the default grip doesn't bother me as much as it does on the Saiga, since most of the gun's weight is supported by the offhand. The trigger is bad, but it's not hard to rapid fire. I will give the 74M points for having a lightweight stock that still provides a nice cheek weld and can fold, and it's not hard to see why this became a single standardized model rather than having separate folding and fixed stock variants. But there's a lot of room for improvement, so let's jump into Aftermarket with a whole pile of Zynico crap. This is mostly Atlas Customs repro stuff, along with a generic no-name RK3 repro intended for GBBRs, and a real Texas Weapon Systems top rail. First off, the PT1 is intended for a 4.5mm pin like the overwhelming majority of Airsoft AK stocks, so it will fit with minimal modification, but it requires a small shim to get the right spacing. It also required a bit of alteration to its spacer plate, but not much, and then it fits and locks up fine. Neat. The RK3s drop in, but required a short M6 screw to mount since the one that came with it was the wrong size. For the Sport 4 handguard, we added a bit of putty to keep the rear of it from sliding up, and had to file the outside of the front for the retainer cap to slip over, but then it stays tight. And yes, I know you're supposed to just hit the retainer with a hammer until it fits, and yeah, we tried that. The rest of the handguard goes on without incident, though it looks like the top rail might be a bit tight on the gas tube as it cants up very slightly. Lastly, the dust cover, and I'll warn you now, replacing the rear sight is a bitch. This leaf spring is stiffer than real ones I've worked with, and I had to resort to pushing it down with a drill press to get the sight out. With that done though, the TWS dust cover parts were a drop-in fit. Note that I went with TWS because Airsoft repros of the B33 mount are typically intended for AEGs, which have longer receivers. So overall, AEG spec furniture will fit, except for dust covers. The result is a Zenitco AK, and I actually like this. Not the grip though, it's long and angular and just not very comfortable, and I much prefer the modern Izhmash grip. Yeah, that's better. And now this is a pretty straightforward modernized AK. It's heavier than stock, and the Sport 4 is total overkill just a foregrip on it, but it balances well, and I really like that the PT1's adjustability facilitates good cheek weld with mounting optics on the dust cover. It's fine, it's good even, but for my personal gun, I'm going in another direction.
This is brilliant, but I like this.
So let's try some real steel compatibility. First, a real Polish 4.5mm side-folding triangle stock. This dropped right in, no modification needed beyond scraping paint out of the hinge, which is a manufacturing issue rather than a compatibility one. Next, a real pistol grip also fits with no modification. This one is from Arsenal. The corresponding Arsenal handguard, however, required that the indexing tabs be filed down very slightly on the upper surface in order to fit, but nothing significant. The Arsenal upper handguard fit without modification, but this one is from B5 Systems. It fits, but it's tight, so it's necessary to use a pair of pliers to help get leverage to install it on the gas tube. One more part needed, and that's a ribbed dust cover. This required substantial alteration. First, we had to cut off the raised bump at the front, then file the entire front to shorten it very slightly. On the right side, it was necessary to bend the edge outwards and do some minor reshaping to ensure it clears the charging handle, and this process is where the carrier picked up those scrapes. Given that the TWS was a drop-in fit with no modification, I think I might chalk this up to real AK variants more so than VFC in accuracy, and it wasn't too much trouble in any case. Now I have a proper STALKER AK-74. Well, aside from the divots, but there's not much I can do about that. But I still dislike these irons, so I'll attach my Cobra and that goes right on with no alteration. All that fuss, and, well, ergonomically, this is entirely identical to the AK-74M I started with, but now I have a toy replica of an ahistorical AK setup from a niche video game series. Aren't I just the coolest? So to summarize, Airsoft folding stops are a drop-in fit but will require a spacer since the hinges are shorter for some reason. Real folding stocks were also drop-in but will need to be 4.5mm variants, not 5.5mm ones. Real pistol grips are drop-in, as are grips intended for GBBRs, but obviously not AEGs. Both real and AEG lower handguards will require minor modification, nothing substantial, and we strongly recommend replacing the VFC lower handguard due to the durability issue discussed earlier. Real upper handguards will fit with little to no modification, as will real gas tubes, and we can confirm that Ultimac railed gas tubes, or clones thereof like this LCT, will fit fine. Real or Airsoft charging handle extensions will fit, but they have to be designed for AK-74s, and ones intended for GHKs or other replicas with AKM style charging handles will not retain properly. And for the dust cover, real ones will fit, possibly with modification, but AEG ones will need to be substantially shortened or may not fit at all. There aren't any upgrades to speak of at the moment, or modifications we recommend beyond just dropping in an adjustable valve, so dress the rifle up as you like and call it a day. That brings us to conclusions. It is a full steel AK with good build quality and generally solid design, where parts that may need to be replaced or modified are easy to access, and parts that pose alignment concerns are straightforward to realign and secure. It does have some minor historical inaccuracies as a replica, and the paint finish is just okay, plus the magazines look odd and wear oddly. Internally, it's again full steel, showing little wear to critical surfaces. It's when you go to shoot it that it really shines, boasting high recoil, the choice between realistic cyclic rate or maximum snappiness, absurd number of shots per fill, 45 round capacity with easy loading, great cold weather performance, great out-of-the-box accuracy, and the ability to accept an adjustable valve for easy tuning to different fields or weather conditions. As far as shooting is concerned, this gun really does it all. The biggest problem with it is just that VFC clearly rushed the initial batch, with that carrier painting issue giving the false impression that it's going to self-destruct, and having to disassemble and lubricate all the mags is really tedious. But once that's done, this is not only the best gas AK on the market, but one of the best GBBRs period. So is it worth it? Well, as far as AKs go, it's not like there are a ton of good options. GHK's V3 has poor efficiency and a bunch of annoying quirks even ignoring QC. WE has pot metal internals, a glacial cyclic rate, and non-existent cold weather performance. The TM is a solid performer, but if you're looking for a full steel gun with high recoil to put real parts on, that ain't it. The market's been lacking for a well-performing, realistically built GBBR AK, and while this certainly isn't cheap at about $650 shipped, when a GHK costs about the same and a WE is only $100 less, I think this is a no-brainer. At least with the mags having relatively high BB capacity, quick recovery from cooldown, and enough gas to not need refilling on the field, a combat load of as little as 3+1 or 4+1 is viable with a speed loader just in case. While there certainly are things to criticize on this design, as well as VFC's incomprehensible decision to ship them bone dry and without manuals, the broad strokes are a GBBR that pretty much does it all, combining full steel build with great recoil and phenomenal shooting performance. Pure collectors may be off-put by the 4.5mm trunnion or aluminum magazines, but for anyone who actually plays Airsoft, I think those nitpicks melt away once you pull the trigger. As the saying goes, never let perfect be the enemy of good, and this is genuinely really good. If it weren't for that lubrication issue, I would say that this is a fantastic entry to GBBRs, so we hope VFC gets the message and corrects that oversight for the second batch. In the meantime, we hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you'd like to support our channel, please consider checking out our merch store in the description. And as always, thanks for watching.